During my third year, another area that I really enjoyed working in was plastics. This was out at Burwood. It was a renowned plastic surgery unit. It had been started by I just can't think of his name right at this moment, Manchester I think it was, the person New Zealander who had done a lot of plastic surgery during the Second World War. He had done all of that work with the pilots who had got burnt during the Second World War, and he had developed the art of plastic surgery on burns for the pilots who were badly burnt. There are some memories of working at Burwood. While I was living in Christchurch, I lived in Cranford Street, and I had to walk quite a long way over to catch the bus out to Burwood, because Burwood was at the very edge of the city. In those days, that was quite a long way out, and I had to catch a bus there and had to be there at 8 o'clock, and one wouldn't dare be late when working at any of these hospitals, so I had to leave quite early. And I do recall working at Burwood during the Wahine storm. It was a wild morning when we woke up. The wind was howling, and I had to walk about 1.5 miles to catch the bus, and I was walking through a park and thought, these trees are going to fall down, and I was really quite frightened. By the time I got over to Hills Road to catch my bus out to the Burwood Hospital, the wind was very wild, and I do recall standing there waiting, and no bus ever came. And I actually happened to know somebody who was living close by. She had been a patient in the orthopaedic ward when I had worked with her for about 6 to 8 weeks, so I had got to know her quite well, and I knew she was close by, so I went and knocked on her door and asked if I could use her phone, and phoned the School of Physiotherapy to say that I wouldn't be in that day because there were no buses. So that's my memory of the Wahine storm, and it was just as well I didn't go out, because some of the older parts of Burwood Hospital, the wind had destroyed windows, and they'd had to close a ward and move the patients, and the last thing they wanted is physiotherapy students around at that time. So that's my memories of the Wahine storm. Plastics was really interesting, and I really quite enjoyed there, and actually later on went back and worked in plastics later on in the 1970s. There are some things that I remember very much. One of them was the really nasty injuries from children who had poured boiling water over themselves. The commonest injury was where children had reached up and pulled the cord of a electric jug and had nasty injuries, boiling water injury, usually around their neck and over their trunk. Of course, these were young children, usually toddlers, and it was excruciatingly painful, these injuries. They very often got nasty stiff necks and keloid scarring, so as physio students we had to work with these children, getting them to exercise their necks. Of course, they didn't want to do that. Another injury that I remember is hand injuries. Once again, the boiling water with hands, nasty injuries with the hands. And another area that I remember was having to do hand exercises with children who were born with syndactyly, and where they'd had separation of their fingers, and they put them in a type of plastic that went over the hand, that kept the hands separated. That is a strong memory I have there. And perhaps one of the areas I had the strongest memories of was hyperspadias was a condition that was treated by the plastic surgeons, and there was this child who had been brought up as a little boy. He lived on the west coast, and they thought it was hyperspadias, but when they investigated it further, it was a little boy who had a child, I should say, who had really, they weren't sure which sex the child was, and as they investigated it more, they found that he had a penis as well as ovaries, and they weren't clear what to do about this, because they wrote to the John Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, who were the experts in the area, and what it seemed as though there was more female than male for this child. They had long discussions with the psychiatrists and psychologists about what to do with this child, and the little boy had been brought up he was 3 years old at this stage, and they decided, even though there was more female than male, they would continue to bring him up as a little boy because that's what the parents wanted, and they would do a hysterectomy and give him hormones when he reached adolescence. But you can imagine, as a young 19-year-old, that really impressed me as a physiotherapy student. And I much later went on to read a very interesting novel about this, which was based on fact, about a child who'd been brought up as a female, but discovered in her teenage years that she was more male than female, and also she was under the care of a specialist at the Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore, and that person actually turned out to be a New Zealander. Although this novel was a novel, it actually was based on fact, and there was a New Zealander working there whose area of expertise was dealing with children who had this hermaphrodite type development. Other areas that we had to work on were burns. I do recall one. He was a farmer from down up the Waitaki Valley, and he was burning off his tussock, and he got caught by the fire, and he had, I presume 60+% of his body was burnt, but particularly his face, and he had extensive, and his hands were very, very badly affected. His trunk was badly affected too. His legs were less so, and the massive amount of operations he had for his face, or his hands, which were just really little stubs. And of course, as a physiotherapist, we had to work with trying to maintain range of movement of all his facial features, because he could barely open his mouth at times because of the contractures on his face, his neck, his trunk, his upper arms were affected, and trying to keep the range of movement of his arms and his hands. We would go into the saline bathrooms and work with these patients in the saline bathrooms. I still recall to this day walking into those saline bathrooms and the smell of Pseudomonas, and as soon as I'm in a hospital and I smell Pseudomonas, I think of the saline bathrooms and what we used to have to go. There was a particular smell, and you just had to brace yourself to go in there because of that particular smell, but also it was excruciatingly painful for these patients. They'd have their saline bath, and the dressings would gradually float off. And then as the physiotherapist, you would do treatment, movement, range of movement exercises to try and increase the range of movement and to try to stop the contractures that was occurring with these patients. But that gentleman, I remember him very clearly because he was so disfigured in his face. Yet over the months that he was in the hospital, the change that was occurred with constant plastic surgery. And of course, this is not too much different from some of the burns that the pilots had in the Second World War.